Okay, hi. Thanks for having me here, and I hope this is interesting and will be useful to the ACAT community as we move forward. Thank you. This will be even better. I'm Dan Katz. I work in software at NCSA, and am interested in trying to understand how we give people credit for software and how we encourage software sharing. And I want to talk about software citation and a kind of an experiment that I believe that ACAT is going to do with its proceedings. So first, just to mention, and this is probably obvious to everybody here, but it's good to have evidence from time to time, that I believe that software, including services, is essential for the bulk of research today. And we can look at that in two different ways. One is by looking at surveys and actually talking to researchers and asking them what they do. And there's two surveys that have happened that I'm aware of that report on this. One was done of UK academics and Russell Group universities about 3 years ago. And the other is one that I and a student did earlier this year about postdocs, members of the National Postdoc Association in the US. We asked them basically a number of questions. One was, how would your research change if you didn't have software available? And about 2/3 said that the research would not be possible without software. Another quarter, roughly, said that the research would be possible, but it would be harder. And a small number said that it would make no difference. And again, these are very general fields of researchers, and so some of them don't use software, which I guess is okay. The other thing we can look at is journals and actually look at how people publish their work and what they say after they publish their work. And again, making the same claim, I can say that kind of informally, we did a study of a number of issues of science and discovered that about half of the papers were software-intensive projects, and most of the others talked about software, even if they weren't really software-intensive. More formally, we looked at issues of Nature in January through March of this year. We found that out of the 40 research articles, 32 of them mentioned software, and they mentioned an average of 6.5 papers, software packages per article. And so it seems, I think, well, it's probably, again, obvious here, but I think we have good evidence that software really is important for research. So if we think about how research works, this is, I would say, a textbook example of how research works. It's not really how research works, but we can pretend for the minute that we first create a hypothesis, and then we acquire some resources, some funding, some software, some data, some things that allow us to test the hypothesis. And then we actually do some research, which could involve building software and building data, could involve building large experiments in Switzerland. It could do lots of things. And we publish the results of that, and we publish them potentially in the form of a paper or of a book or of software itself or of the data that's the output of the process. And that's the knowledge that comes out of this process. And we then, ideally, use that knowledge to be able to go back. And we do that because we gain some recognition for what we've done, and that makes people convinced that we can continue this process and can go on. So you'll see software shows up in 3 places here, and it really shows up in 2 different ways. So the first thing is that software, again, is part of the research. Right? It's done by the individual researchers. They need it in order to answer the question they're trying to answer. But it also shows up as infrastructure. And the infrastructure piece is the things that come into the research process and the things that go out of the research process. The things that are not the researcher themselves is not developing, but they're using from somebody else, or they're going to share with somebody else who then can do better research later themselves. And so this infrastructure software in particular is the thing that is shared and the thing that we want to make citable, I would argue, ideally. So if we're going to make this citable, then one other thing that we want to do to get to recognition is we want to be able to measure these contributions. And we have the fact that we have a citation system that is widely used and that was created for papers and for books. And so we need to do one of 2 things, or both of 2 things. We either need to jam software into the current citation system so that we can look at citations of software and references to software, or we have to rework the citation system entirely and open it up to all sorts of other objects and think about what its failings are and how it could be improved. And we're going to focus on the first one because the second one is just too hard to do at this point. And we can actually do something in the first one that's really practical and possible. So the overall challenge here is not to identify software in a paper, but to identify software to be used within the research process. And again, if we can identify it and we can track it, then we can give credit to the people that have built it. And we can encourage them thus to build it more and to share more of it. So we had an activity called the Force 11 Software Citation Group. Force 11 stands for the Future of Research Scholarship and Future of Research Communication and E-Scholarship. This group started in 2011. In 2015, we started a working group within it that was looking at software citation. And it was co-led by myself and Arvin Smith, who was at GitHub at the time and was the developer on Galaxy Zoo. And so he was coming out of a research field as well. A couple of months later, we had a workshop that was called Working Towards Sustainable Software for Science, Practice, and Experience, or WSPE. And this is the third workshop. And it had a number of working groups formed. One of those working groups was looking at credit and citation. And Kyle Niemeyer from Oregon State was leading that group. And we realized at the end of that meeting that these two activities should join rather than remaining separate. And so that's what happened. And Kyle then became a co-lead of the Force 11 group. We had about 60 members when we finished up, a mix of researchers and developers and publishers and librarians and people that run repositories and archives and funders as well. We did all of our work on GitHub, so everything that we did was open and shared, and we used GitHub issues to communicate and to make decisions. And so anybody that is interested can look at what we did and try to understand why we did it by looking through those issues. We reviewed existing community practices and developed use cases. Just as an example, like the astronomy community uses ADS to track citations, and they use something called ASCL to index software. And so we looked at examples like that and what happened in different communities. We drafted a software citation principles document. It started with a set of data citation principles that had been published about a year and a half earlier. And we updated the data citation principles based on the software use cases and related work and the working group discussions that we had and community feedback and a lot of different drafts and reviews of those drafts and a workshop that happened in April of 2016. And then we submitted and had reviewed and modified many times in response to the review comments and then eventually published this paper called Software Citation Principles that was in PeerJ Computer Science in September of last year. It was also interesting that the PeerJ process is kind of, well, in the PeerJ process, when you finish having a paper reviewed, the question that comes before you publish the paper is, do you want to have the reviews published as an appendix? And so we did that as well. They're anonymous, but you can see what the reviewers said and how we responded to that feedback. So the document contains a set of principles, which I'm going to go into in the next couple of slides, which really are general statements. They're very high level in a lot of ways. A set of use cases, which is where the principles should apply, and then a lot of discussion, which was suggestions on how to apply the principles. And the reason the discussion is discussion as opposed to principles is that it's our opinion, and it's not, I would say, 100% clear what the right answer is in some cases, and so there's alternatives in many cases. I'm not going to go through the discussion because I have 15 minutes here, but if you're interested in the paper, it goes into a lot of different elements of this. So the first principle is importance, which says that software should be considered a legitimate and citable product of research, and that software citations should be accorded the same importance as citations of other research products like papers and books. And it actually goes on to say that the reference list should include these citations in the same way it includes other citations. Right? They shouldn't be put in a different section and a method section and something else, but they are equal to other work that you're citing in your research. Second principle is credit and attribution, which says that the purpose or a purpose of software citations is to give credit and attribution to all contributors to the software. And this leads to lots of questions, and this is part of the discussion about what does all contributors mean? Is it the people that put on software on GitHub? Is it people that did testing but don't actually have any contributions on GitHub? Is it people that got funding? So there's, again, a lot of questions about what all contributors means, but the goal is to give credit to all contributors. Third principle is unique identification, which says that a software citation should include a method for identification that's machine actionable, globally unique, interoperable, and recognized by a community of domain experts, which basically says that the way we do software citations may differ somewhat from community to community, which could be a problem, and that's one of the things that needs to get worked through. Fourth is persistence, which says that the identifiers in the metadata describing the software should persist even beyond the lifespan of the software. And so just as an example of this, you might say that my software is on GitHub, and I'm just going to point to the repository, and that's good enough. And the reason that that might not be good enough is that GitHub is a commercial service, which is extremely widely used today. but Google Code was extremely widely used 5 years ago, and GitHub likely at some point in the future will go away and be replaced by something else. And so in some ways, we want to think about the archival purposes of this, not just the sharing purpose that we have today. Fifth principle is accessibility, which says that the citation should facilitate access to the software itself and the associated materials necessary to make informed use of the software. And the last principle is specificity, which says that the citation should facilitate identification of and access to the specific version of the software that was used, not to say we're going to use root, but we used root version 3.1 or whatever the right version is. Okay, so let me give 2 examples in place of the long discussion section. So one is that let's assume that you've written some software and you want to make it citable so other people are going to cite it in their papers and in their work. The first thing that you would do is to publish it. And if the software is on GitHub, there's a very easy way to do this. Working with Zenodo through this guide, you can also publish software in other ways. You can submit it manually to Zenodo or to Figshare as examples with appropriate metadata that includes the authors and the title and the citations that you're going to say that you were depended on in writing this software and other software that you used in developing the software. Once you've done this, Zenodo or Figshare or equivalent will give you a DOI, and you then create a citation file, which right now we believe is a plain text file called citation that's in the root of the repository. But that's also a bit up for discussion because it's not machine readable and we'd like to do something better, but that's where we are now. And you update your README and you tell people how to cite the software. And then they cite it, hopefully. You can also write a software paper and ask people to cite that paper, and I know that's what the more common thing has been. But we really would very much like to have software directly cited rather than having papers about software cited. This goes back to a quote from Donahoe from 1990, roughly, that says that the research is the software, the paper is just advertising about the research. Okay, if you want to cite somebody else's software, you should check for a citation file or a README, and if this is there, it'll tell you how to cite the software itself, and if so, that's what you should do. If it's not there, you should do your best to follow the principles. So you should try to include all those contributors to the software, maybe by just naming the project if you can't figure out who all the contributors are. Try to include a method for identification that's machine actionable, globally unique, and interoperable. And this might be a URL to a release or a company product number if this is commercial software. If there's a landing page that includes metadata, point to that and not directly to the software. And include the specific version and release information. If there is a software paper, it's fine to cite that as well, but we would really strongly argue again that you shouldn't cite the software paper in place of citing the software. Right? The software paper may have more information that is important as well, and so that's fine. Okay, so to give some examples from ACAT of some things that people might want to cite, right, here's just a list of things, and these I would say are very ugly citations at this point because none of these software packages have been published, and so we have to kind of do things that go around what the principles are and try to meet them as best as we can, following the examples on the previous slide. You can see for a lot of these, I just made these up on Tuesday, given a set of things that Gordon had provided of packages that would be interesting. And so with almost all of these, we can come up with a version, we can come up with a year, we can come up with a title. We use the word software in square brackets to indicate that this is software, so somebody that's looking at a citation list will know that this is software and not a paper. We can provide a method of getting to the software, and if it's a URL, I personally think it's good practice to say when you access that URL so that somebody that tries it again later may know why it doesn't work. The last project was one where I could actually find the authors because they were listed, and so I did. So this, again, is examples for unpublished software. There's also examples for published software. And so this is a few different things that have been published, 2 through Zenodo, 1 through Figshare, and 1 through the Journal of Open Source Software, which I'll talk about in a second. And so these then become better looking citations because somebody's already created the metadata and I don't have to go try to find it. Right? They told me who the authors are. They gave, in some cases, names of a paper and an equivalent to a paper. Right, and they gave version numbers and better dates and things like that. So the proceedings are coming up as well as best I understand. I hear that there's some question about exactly how long this is going to be until there will be proceedings information and when stuff will be due. No? Everything will be done? Okay, great. If you look at the proceedings link that's on the web page, there's a link for presenter information and proceedings. And it says, citing software, ACAT is trying an experiment this year, so software citation of software. Okay. I didn't actually notice that until right now either. For general background on this topic, see the talk given at the conference, which is this talk, and more info to come. And hopefully that'll happen soon. And my guess is more info to come will include guidelines from the organizers, and I'm just guessing because I'm not one of the organizers. And maybe we'll include these slides. And so we would like people to try this and to see if this works. And in particular, if you've written software or you're responsible for software that you think is going to be cited, it would be great to publish a version of it and to update your file and ask people to cite it in a better way than this. Okay, just quickly, I'll mention the Journal of Open Source Software is an option here. JOSS, it's a developer-friendly journal for research software packages. The quote that goes along with it is if you've licensed your code and have good documentation, it should take less than an hour to prepare and submit your paper. Everything about JOSS is open. The published paper, the submitted paper, the code itself, the reviews in the process are done through GitHub issues, and so you can see how this happens as it happens. The code for the journal itself is also open, so if you want to spin off a different journal, you can do that. Zenodo then archives the JOSS papers and issues DOIs. First paper was submitted in May of last year. May of this year, we had 111 accepted papers and another 55 roughly in process. And about a month ago, we had 125 accepted papers and about 70 more that were in progress. So this is catching on and seems to be doing well. And as you saw on the previous slide, at least one high-energy physics paper has gone through this route. So just to conclude then, the Software Citation Working Group ended in May of this year. We started a new Software Citation Implementation Group also in May with the intent of trying to actually implement these ideas and working with publishers and repositories and funders and other people to say, what do we actually need to make this work, and how can we help, and how can we do things in common so that everybody doesn't have to do this individually. We're planning that work. We're considering an endorsement period where people will say that these principles are good and we agree with them even if we haven't implemented them yet. And we may write a full implementation examples paper to go through the 15 use cases and explain in detail how the principles actually apply for each of them. If you're interested in joining this, you can sign up on the Forts 11 group page, and that's here, and you have that. And that's really all that I'm going to say. Other than, I would like to have discussion about this, but given the time, I don't think that that's really going to be possible. I would say if anybody has questions, my contact information is here. I'd be very happy to try to answer questions by email or schedule follow-up calls or something else. And I assume the organizers here will also really be the interface to actually make this experiment happen and see what happens. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, speakers. And I would like to